But if you've been with us, you know that 7 weeks ago on Easter weekend, we began a series called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. It's been based on a book by the same title, a book I've recommended to you, a book that I've drawn from frequently during this series. But we said this is an important topic to talk about. You may say, well, I'm not an atheist. Why do we need to talk about this? But spiritual skepticism is on the rise in our culture. To say I'm an atheist is becoming bit more popular, or an agnostic, or I just have spiritual questions, or to just kind of disassociate from the Christian faith is becoming much more common and popular today, because many people think that to be a Christian means to believe in myth or legend, or at the very least to believe in unsubstantiated claims. And so we started this conversation by saying, God is a God who invites investigation. We saw that on Easter weekend. Jesus invites investigation, that God doesn't ask us to believe in him blindly or to believe in him in spite of the evidence against him. But as we saw, as we look at the evidence for God, evidence in the scientific world, evidence in the philosophical world, that believing in God is actually the most logical conclusion we can come to. And in actuality, it takes much less faith to be a Christian than it does to say that God doesn't exist or to be an atheist. Now, an atheist would say, or a spiritual skeptic may say, well, why in the world would I need faith in order to not believe in something? I can understand why it would take faith to believe in God, but I don't understand why it would take faith to not believe in him. But as we've seen, all religious worldviews take faith, including atheism, because all religious worldviews make truth claims that can't be proven with 100% certainty. And so if I make the truth claim of an atheist, there is no God, I can't prove that with a 100% certainty. So there's going to have to be some faith that what I'm claiming to be true is actually true. And the same is true for the truth claim of a theist. When I say that there is actually a God, I believe there's a God, I can't be certain with 100% certainty. And so therefore, I have to have some faith for that truth claim that there is a God. But while we can't know all truth claims of these religious worldviews with 100% certainty, these truth claims can be investigated, and that's what we've been doing. We can look at the evidence, see which truth claim is the most probable. And this is one of the points we've made at the beginning of the series. We've been coming back to it all throughout, that when I make a truth claim, I look at the evidence, and the less evidence there is for that truth claim, the more faith I need, because faith is that gap between where the evidence leaves off and the truth claim kind of starts, right? But the more evidence I have for a truth claim, the smaller the gap. Therefore, the less faith I need. You see, faith fills the gap between the evidence and the truth claim that I'm making. We use the illustration of the Holocaust. You know, the Holocaust is a great example of this. While we can't prove the Holocaust with absolute certainty, most people believe the Holocaust actually happened. However, there are a few people who believe the Holocaust was all a conspiracy. It's all just made up. It's all a hoax. So which is it? Well, okay, we can't know for absolute certainty that the Holocaust is true, but we can look at the evidence. We study the pictures. We hear the testimony of the eyewitnesses. We actually hear enemy attestation, which is very credible. Actual Nazis who said, yes, we perpetrated this crime. We look at and investigate the death camps. We watch the videos. The evidence is overwhelming. It points to the fact that there was a Holocaust. This means to believe in the Holocaust doesn't take a lot of faith, because the evidence kind of gets us up to the point where the truth claim starts. The gap is very small. It doesn't take a lot of faith, but it takes some faith, I suppose, right? We have to believe the evidence is true. Maybe not all of the questions are answered. But to not believe the Holocaust takes a whole lot more faith, because there's such little evidence for the claim that there was no Holocaust. Therefore, the gap is huge. I need a whole lot of faith to believe that the Holocaust didn't happen. So in the same way as we look at evidence for the existence of God, we see overwhelming scientific and philosophical evidence that God does indeed exist. This is a theistic universe. Can we know with absolute certainty? No. But because of all of the evidence, the gap between where the evidence leaves off and where our faith claims begins, it's very small. It takes less faith. The bottom line, as we look at the evidence, it takes a lot of faith to believe that God doesn't exist. So today we conclude with this last point. And here's what I'd like to conclude with. Because of the Big Bang, therefore Jesus is God. Okay, I hear a couple of reactions. Now, if you're not paying attention, you're not going to react to that. But you're like, what in the world? Because of the Big Bang, therefore Jesus is God. Doesn't that seem to be a huge leap in logic? Because of the Big Bang, Jesus is God. What in the world are you talking about? But here's the point. We started with the Big Bang, and over the last 7 weeks, we've been building a case. We've been building a case by looking at all the evidence, and we've been building a foundation to come to the point where we can finally say Jesus is God. We're coming full circle today. You see, the Big Bang demonstrates the fact that God exists because if the universe had a beginning, which indeed it did, the universe had a beginning, therefore it needs a cause. We've seen that cause is God, the cosmological argument. Next, we saw that since God worked through the law, outside of the laws of nature, in order to create the universe, in other words, he worked a miracle, worked outside of the laws of nature to create the universe, therefore we know that God who created the universe is a God who acts. And if God is a God who acts, we can have acts of God. Right? We looked at miracles and the possibility of miracles. And we see, as we look at our universe, we see that God has indeed acted. That God acted to fine-tune the universe, to be able to support life on this little planet called Earth. That God acted in creating the world as we know it, and creating life in all of its complexity and all of its diversity. God acted. And God acted when we threw his creation into death and chaos through our rebellion against him. That God acted by sending his son into the world to rescue the world that rebelled against him. In other words, because of the Big Bang, therefore, Jesus is God. And you may think, well, this conclusion is a bit premature. We need a little bit more evidence. And I think if you say so, you're probably right. We need one more piece of evidence or one more argument before we could really reach this conclusion and consider the implications of this conclusion that Jesus is God. But first, let me just recap really quick what we've covered the last couple of weeks. We spent the first 4 weeks really looking at arguments for the existence of God. But the last 4 weeks, we saw these things to be true beyond a reasonable doubt, that Jesus was a real person who lived 2,000 years ago. We've shown the evidence for that. True beyond a reasonable doubt. Number two, we've seen that the New Testament is a historically accurate eyewitness account of his life, death, and subsequent resurrection. These are reliable documents. And finally, we saw last week that those eyewitnesses are extremely credible, that they had no reason to make up or fabricate the stories of his life or his teachings or his miracles. As a matter of fact, we saw that they had every reason to deny his teaching and his miracles and his resurrection because it ended up costing them all their lives. So we can know, based on the overwhelming evidence, that we have reliable, credible, accurate, well-preserved accounts of the teaching and ministry of Jesus. And here's the bottom line. These credible, early eyewitnesses wrote about these historical, verifiable accounts about a man who worked miracles and claimed to be God. Again, here's one of those truth claims. Jesus says, I am God incarnate. He didn't use those words, but he said in so many words and through his actions, I am the Son of God. I am sent of God. It's a truth claim. Is he God or isn't he? Well, we can't know with 100% accuracy, but we can look at the evidence and we can be led to the most probable conclusion. And let me just state, you may see this as obvious, but I believe that all the evidence overwhelmingly supports the fact that he is who he said he was, that he was God. And if you're here today and you're spiritually skeptical, you'd say, well, of course you believe that. That's because you're a Christian, right? But the fact that I'm a Christian isn't the issue. The issue is, why am I a Christian? And I'm a Christian because of the evidence. I'd like to look at 3 lines of evidence today that support Jesus' claim that he was God in the flesh. And the first one is this. Jesus fulfilled countless Old Testament prophecies that predicted who the Messiah would be. You see, hundreds of years before Jesus was born, we have these Old Testament documents, these prophets who were led by God would write about the Messiah who was to come, the deliverer, the rescuer, the Son of God who would come, and they gave signs about where he would be born and when he would be born and how he would live and how he would die and what his ministry would be about. Hundreds of these prophecies are in the Old Testament, and what we find in Jesus is a complete fulfillment of all of these prophecies from the Old Testament. things outside of his control. Let me just read you one snippet, it's a longer snippet, of one prophecy in the Old Testament. This is taken from Isaiah chapter 53. And he's writing about, this is in 700 BC that this is being written. We know this was written before Jesus was born because we have copies of this prophecy that were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls that date to 200 BC. Right, so we know that this was written at a minimum 200 years before Jesus was born. And if you know anything about the story of Jesus, just listen for the signs in this story as Isaiah prophesies about the Messiah. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering. Like one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities, or for our sins. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity, or the sin, the rebellion of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, and yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. And who could speak of his descendants? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was stricken. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. And after the suffering of his soul, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. Wow, that's pretty descriptive. Written 700 years before Christ, yet it is a perfect description of what Jesus would do, particularly in the cross, the crucifixion event. He was despised and rejected. He was a man of sorrows. He took up our infirmities, was pierced for our rebellion, our transgression. His punishment brought us peace, and by his wounds we are healed. He didn't open his mouth when he was accused. We know that from his trial. He stood silent. He was led off like a lamb to slaughter. He had no descendants because he died before he was able to have children. But after his death, he comes back to the land of the living, or rather, he was resurrected. I mean, if this is all we had from the Old Testament, we would say that's pretty good evidence that Jesus is the fulfillment of this messianic figure. But we have so much more. And before you think that maybe this is a fluke, or maybe it's like a horoscope, it's kind of general, maybe he just kind of fulfilled it. Or maybe you think, oh, it's all self-fulfilling, maybe Jesus just kind of did all these things on purpose just to fulfill it. We have to understand that there are many, many more, hundreds of specific prophecies in the Old Testament that Jesus would not have been able to fulfill because they're outside of his control. Things like these, that it's predicted that he would be from the tribe of Judah. That means we've now taken all of Judaism and broken into 12 tribes. Now it's 1/12 of all Judaism that he could possibly come from, a son of David. Now we've got even less of the tribe of Judah because he has to be from the family of David. We're down to about 3 or 4% of all of Judaism he can come from, born in Bethlehem. Further narrows the field that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. He will be preceded by a messenger who comes in the spirit of Elijah. The Old Testament says, and he will visit the temple. It would have to be before it was destroyed in 70 AD, so the Messiah would have to come before 70 AD. If you know the prophecy of Daniel chapter 9, a fascinating prophecy that gives a timeline for when Messiah would come, when this timeline would start, when it would end, and we're able to do the math and see that he would be baptized in 27 AD, he would die in 30 AD. That's pretty specific. That they would divide and gamble for his clothing, that he would be buried with the rich, again, a borrowed tomb, Joseph of Arimathea, and that he would rise from the dead. I mean, how many people all through history could fulfill even just these 10 prophecies? But as you begin to dig into the Old Testament, again, we find that there are hundreds of such prophecies given about the Messiah and what he would do and where he would be born and what he would be like, and Jesus fulfills them all. So what this tells us is that God said what he was going to do ahead of time, and then he fulfilled that through his son, Jesus. He did it. And this, I believe, confirms that Jesus gives a lot of evidence he is who he said he is. But the second line of evidence isn't only the fact that he fulfilled all these Old Testament messianic prophecies, but also that he performed dozens of miracles. According to the accounts of his life, the disciples who followed him, as well as the crowds, at first didn't think that Jesus was anyone in particularly special, maybe just another teacher with good teaching, and they followed him for his teaching. But they soon realized that he was more than just a good teacher, that he was divine. And what was it that convinced them that he was more than just a good teacher? wasn't his good looks, wasn't the content of his teaching. According to the accounts, it was the miracles that he worked. We're dealing with something. We don't see this all the time. We're enlightened enough to know these things don't happen. It started at a wedding where he changes water into wine, as the account says, in order to show his glory, give credibility to his ministry. But then it turned out to be healing sick people and lame people, and then giving sight to the blind, and then feeding 5,000 people with just a few loaves and a few fish, walking on water, calming the storm as we heard about this morning, or even raising a dead man who had been dead for 4 days. Jesus performs, we're told, somewhere, give or take, 35 miracles in all are recorded in the gospel accounts. And it's clearly the miracles that convinced the disciples and the other followers that he was more than a man, more than a teacher. He was the Son of God. On several occasions when he would work one of these miracles, like the story we heard this morning, the disciples would fall on their faces, on their knees before him in worship and adoration because they realized his miracles gave away his true identity. And before you write these stories off, again, as legend or myth or embellishment of the story, remember, we have seen, evidence says miracles are possible. We live in a theistic universe where God can do what he wants to do. He's already performed the greatest miracle perhaps ever when he did whatever he does, speaks a word, and the universe came into being out of nothing, right? And so a God who could orchestrate something as complex and powerful as a big bang of the universe could certainly walk on water or bring someone back to life after being dead for 4 days. And second, for the past 2 weeks, we've looked at the overwhelming evidence that demonstrates the New Testament is not a legend, it's not a lie, it's not an embellishment, but it is a reliable historical account of actual events recorded by reliable eyewitnesses. So we can believe the things that are written about the life of Jesus. And as we look objectively at the evidence, we see that it is completely reasonable and logical to believe that the miracles that are recorded in the New Testament were actually done by Jesus, which confirms that he is who he said he is. So not only do we have him fulfilling countless Old Testament prophecies and performing dozens of miracles during his short ministry, but perhaps most convincingly, his resurrection from the dead is that thing that lets us know he is who he said he is more than anything. I mean, a guy who predicts his own resurrection and pulls it off, how do you do that? And this brings us back to where we began. If you're with us week 1, we started with a story from John chapter 2. Where Jesus comes into Jerusalem for the first time during his ministry. He goes into the temple and he's just distraught by what he sees. He's angry by what he sees. He's seeing a marketplace in the temple and people are being taken advantage of in the name of God. And so he just kind of loses it and he clears the temple. All the money changers and all the merchants are driven from the temple, and the religious leaders aren't real happy about this, and so they come to him afterwards and they question him. What authority do you have to do this? Who are you? What right do you have to do what you just did? What authority do you have? And remember how Jesus responded in so many words. Jesus said, you want to know what authority I have? Okay, I'll tell you what. You're going to kill me. I know you're going to kill me. But 3 days later, I'm going to rise from the grave, come to my grave. You'll see that it's empty, and then you will know I am who I said I am. This is the event, this is the sign that Jesus continually pointed to throughout his ministry, that we would know who he is, that he is who he said he was, the resurrection. He predicted his own resurrection from the dead, and then according to the New Testament account, he pulled it off. And if he really did predict the fact that he was going to rise from the grave 3 days later, and if he really did in fact pull it off, would that not be all the evidence that we would need that this guy is more than a man? This man is whoever he says he is. How else could we explain the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies, all the miracles that he worked, and then the fact the greatest of those being predicting and pulling off his own resurrection? And the overwhelming first century evidence is that he did indeed pull it off. He did rise from the grave 3 days after his crucifixion. This isn't something that we have to believe on blind faith just because our grandmothers told us or our mother told us or because it's just written in the Bible. No, there is evidence that this isn't the stuff of myths and legends. Gary Habermas is perhaps, he completed one of the most comprehensive investigations of the resurrection. What he did was he pulled together all 1,400 of the most critical scholarly works on the resurrection that were published or written between like 1975 and 2003. And he just poured over all of these accounts and all of these papers and books on the resurrection. And the authors of these papers they range, the ideological range from, Bible thumping, extremely conservative scholars to extremely liberal scholars who that don't even believe that Jesus is divine or the Son of God, just a good teacher. And what he found is that virtually all scholars agree on the following as historical facts. That everyone, pretty much wherever they are, they agree that these things are historical fact. Number one, that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. This is important because if he didn't die, then he couldn't rise again, right? But it's pretty much a historical fact. Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. Number two, he was buried most likely in a private tomb. All right? It's pretty much a historical fact. Number three, shortly after his death and burial, the disciples were discouraged and despondent, having lost hope. This is important because, again, this takes away any motive that the disciples would have to, like, steal the body or start a new religion. That wasn't even on their mind. They were like, okay, this is done. He's not who we thought he was. His teachings really don't matter anymore. None of that matters anymore. It's done. We're going back to fishing. Number four, Jesus' tomb was found empty very soon after his burial. Historical fact. Right? Number five, the disciples had experiences that they believed were actual appearances of the risen Jesus. This is historical fact. These guys believed they saw Jesus alive again. Number six, as a result of these experiences, the disciples' lives were thoroughly transformed and they were willing to die for their testimony. I mean, something happened to change these guys. Number seven, the proclamation of the resurrection took place very early from the beginning of church history. And we documented this. We talked about this several weeks ago. But this is important because a lot of skeptics will say the resurrection became a myth that developed in the second, third centuries, hundreds of years after Jesus died, after the eyewitnesses were dead, after the evidence had gone cold. It just kind of developed. Now, we know historical fact. The resurrection was a teaching of the church from the very beginning. Number eight, the disciples' public testimony and preaching of the resurrection took place in the city of Jerusalem. This is incredibly important because if you are propagating a myth or a lie, you are not going to do it in the very place where the events happen weeks after they happen. If you want to make up a lie that Jesus rose from the grave, you're going to go to some obscure place in the world, and you're going to say, yeah, we follow this God who died and rose again. And you're going to wait for things to blow over in Jerusalem, give it 40 or 50 years, wait for the eyewitnesses to die. Then you bring it back to Jerusalem to try to start a new religion. But if you're actually describing real events in a place where they actually happened, where the empty tomb was, where there were eyewitnesses everywhere, that would kind of smack of authenticity. Where Jesus had been crucified, and this was the centrality of their message. Again, they weren't trying to start a new religion. They weren't like, hey, we have to spread the teachings of Jesus. Their central message was, he died and he's alive again. That was the central theme of Christianity during the first century. He died, now he's alive. You could be alive too. Number 9. This is great. I love this. James, this is historically, this is verifiable fact. James, the brother of Jesus, was a skeptic before his death, was converted when he believed he saw the risen Jesus and ended up dying for his belief. What would it take for you to convince one of your siblings that you're the Son of God? That would be pretty hard, right? I mean, it's like they grew up with you, they know you. It's like, yeah, I'm God's son. It's like, oh my word, I'm going to give you a, wet willy or something, It's like, what do you, so of course, James, Jesus' brother, is like the whole time his whole ministry, he's not convinced. I know you. At one point, he and the family come to get Jesus and take him home because they think he's lost his mind. But something happened in James's life. After Jesus died, that totally changed the course of his life. He ended up becoming a leader of the church in Jerusalem and ended up giving his life for his belief that his brother really was God's son who had died and risen again. Or perhaps the best story in the New Testament, Saul of Tarsus, Paul, the Apostle Paul, St. Paul, the guy who wrote half the New Testament, the biggest enemy of the church. This guy is on a rampage going around the church, imprisoning, killing Christians. Something happened to him. He became a Christian believer due to an experience that he also believed was an appearance of the risen Christ. These are actual historical facts. So this is where the evidence leads. What else would explain this, the fact that all these historical facts other than the fact that Jesus actually rose from the grave. Now, there are certainly alternate theories as to how these things happened, but all of them have fatal flaws, and none of them have evidence. For instance, some will give the wrong tomb theory. The wrong tomb theory says that the women and the disciples on Easter Sunday went to the wrong tomb, a tomb that was empty. They saw it was empty, assumed Jesus had risen from the grave, and then began to spread the resurrection myth. Fatal flaw. It wasn't the empty tomb that started a movement. It was the appearances of Jesus that started a movement. The fact that Jesus appeared to not only the disciples and the women, but over 500 eyewitnesses between his resurrection and ascension. It wasn't the empty tomb that got things going. It was Jesus actually showing up and appearing to people that changed everything, made them willing to die. Others will promote the swoon theory. The swoon theory says that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross, but he kind of swooned. He went into some kind of a shock. Maybe he wasn't really dead. He was unconscious. And so that when they put him into the tomb, he was still somewhat alive. And then he just kind of revived on Sunday and then appeared to the disciples. But this has a lot of fatal flaws too. Again, there's no evidence for this. A lot of fatal flaws. Number one, the Romans, experts at death. They knew how to kill people. They knew when people were dead. They verified that he was dead. The accounts say that Pilate actually sent a centurion to verify the fact that he was dead. They pronounced him dead. More than that, an eyewitness records that a spear was thrust into Jesus' side and that water and blood flowed out. Now, I'm no doctor, but I'm told that means that the pericardium chamber had been pierced, which means that a person is definitely, unequivocally dead. Now, this is in a time before they knew things like pericardium chambers or what happens when a pericardium chamber is punctured. Therefore, it had to be an eyewitness who saw this, who then later wrote it down, who gave us evidence that he was actually dead. Or how do you explain how he would have survived being embalmed in 75 pounds of spices? Or how did he survive the weekend in the tomb and then roll a 2-ton stone out of the way in order to get out and appear to his disciples? But we do know that he had been through so much trauma leading up to his crucifixion, from being flogged, having flesh literally ripped from his body through flogging, pierced through his hands, his feet, pierced in his side, crown of thorns on his head. He had been beaten in the face, that if he were somehow to survive, get the 2-ton stone out of the way, appear to his disciples, he would have been in such bad shape. They would not have fallen on their faces and worshiped him. They would have pitied him. They would have been like, let's get you to a doctor. Right? That's the kind of shape that Jesus would have been in. No. Then, of course, there's the theory the disciples stole the body. But again, this makes no sense whatsoever because, first of all, the disciples had no motive to steal the body. They believed that the whole thing was over. Their hopes were dashed. They believed that Jesus was not who he said he was because of the fact that he had died. They figured the whole movement was over. This wasn't the man they thought he was. But more than that, they were terrified themselves. They thought that they were going to die. They have no motive to go to the tomb and steal the body, nor do they have means. The tomb is being guarded by Roman guards and centurions, so how are they going to get at the tomb? Third, that wouldn't explain the transformation in these men after the resurrection, from cowardly to courageous, from terrified to die to totally willing to die. Kill me now because I know what's going to happen to me because I saw what happened to him. You see, it doesn't make sense, nor is there any evidence for this theory or any of them. And that's the thing. At some point, we could raise alternate theories, but we have to start saying, here's evidence for these alternate theories. Here's first century evidence for these alternate theories, but there is none. They are nothing more, I believe, than theories created by anti-supernatural bias. All the evidence points to the fact that, number one, Jesus fulfilled countless Old Testament prophecies, that he performed dozens of miracles during his ministry to confirm the fact that he was more than just a teacher. And ultimately, he predicted and pulled off his own resurrection. So according to all the evidence, not only did he say he was God, but he backed it up. Since he is God, an expression of the all-powerful, supremely intelligent, morally perfect God who created the universe, there are implications for that. One of those implications is that whatever he teaches is true. Right? He is the source of all truth. So when he says it's better to give than to receive, or it's good to love your enemies, we got to know those things, whatever he said, it's true. But more than just knowing that whatever he said is true, whatever he says about the rest of the Bible would also be true as the source of hope, or as a source of truth and source of right and wrong. And if Jesus said he was God, and then he backed it up by being crucified and resurrected 3 days later, then whatever he says about the Bible, I'm good with that. That's just me. But I'm with a guy who can pull off his own resurrection. And he made it clear he saw the Bible as authoritative and an expression of God's will. He actually referenced some of the most difficult passages that we have in our scientific age, some of those stories that were like, what? Like Adam and Eve and creation and Noah and Jonah and the big fish. I mean, he actually referenced these stories like he believed they were true, because he did. And again, if the guy who can conquer death believes it's true, that's good enough for me. But not only are the things he taught true, but we could also say the things he said he would do, he will do those things. That he will follow through. He didn't only predict his resurrection, he predicted he was going to do many other things. And if he made good on the first one, we could be sure he's going to make good on the others as well. For instance, he said, whoever believes in me will not perish but have everlasting life, eternal life. Phew. That's mind-blowing. A guy came, said, I'm from God. I'm going to prove it. He proved it. And then he said, you know what? I'm here to tell you, God so loves you that he sent me. And he didn't send me to condemn the world, but he sent me to rescue the world, to save the world. And all you need to do is believe in me, and you'll live forever with me. How could that be a bad deal? That is great news. More than that, he said this. He said, I will come again, so that where I am, there you may be also. Jesus apparently likes to be with us. He likes having us around. He likes being in relationship with us. He's not going to leave us on our own. He's not going to leave us in the mess that we've made of this world. But he's going to come again. He's going to take us to be with him so that we could be with him where he is. That means that he will ultimately come and set all things right on this planet. Every injustice, every imbalanced scale will be made right. He'll come again. What are you going to do with this? Or what have you done with this? I mean, how do you respond to someone who says, I'm God, and then backs it up? When someone says and does the kind of thing Jesus said and did, they demand a response. You can't be indifferent to such things. I mean, in the words of to paraphrase C.S. Lewis, when someone says, I'm God in the flesh, it demands a response. Either we need to call him a lunatic or fall at his feet and call him Lord. There's no in between. It demands a response. What will you do? What will you choose to believe? What will you believe about God, about Jesus? Not on blind faith, but on the evidence. Evidence that he is. And let's be clear. To believe that Jesus is God's son doesn't mean that all of my questions are answered, that I now know everything, that I have no doubts, that I have complete faith in everything. No. I mean, to be a Christian doesn't mean we have all the answers. Truth be told, you'll probably always have unanswered questions. Otherwise, life would be boring. Chances are you'll probably always have doubts. Otherwise, you'll never need faith, right? But to believe doesn't mean you don't have questions, even really big questions. To believe simply means, I've looked at the evidence, and I believe Jesus is who he said he is. Right? To believe means I may not know how God created the world, but I believe that Jesus is God. Or I may not know what happened to the dinosaurs, but I believe he died for my sin. I may not understand why there's suffering in the world or why there's violence in the Old Testament, but I believe he's coming back to make all things right. If through this series God has gained any ground in your heart or your mind, maybe you've begun to believe things that maybe you didn't believe before, I believe you've got to do something about it. You have to affirm that belief. Otherwise, you lose that belief. You need to let go of your identity. You know, we get so fixated on the labels we create for ourselves. We become a kind of a summation of all of our labels. I am atheist. I am agnostic. It gives me a sense of pride, our identity, and who I am. We need to be willing to let go of such labels. I'm atheist. I'm agnostic. And to be willing to say, you know what, maybe I have a new identity. Maybe I'm a believer. Maybe I don't know everything that I believe, but I believe that God exists. I believe that Jesus is his son. I believe that since he is God's son, I could trust the things he said are true. And if you believe, you may wonder, well, what do I do with that? Let me just give you a couple simple, maybe takeaways that you could probably implement today, or at least begin today. And number one, the first thing to do is tell God. You know, if he exists and he is the God that we see in the evidence from the Big Bang, he is personal. If he is the God that we see through Jesus, he is loving. He wants relationship and communication. We can just kind of go to him and say, God, I can't believe I'm talking to you. Maybe before I would have thought I was crazy, maybe talking to myself, but I believe that you are, and I just want to say I believe in you, and I'm sorry for not believing in you sooner. Maybe I'm sorry for blaspheming you or saying bad things about you, but I now realize that you are, and help me believe more. Right? Just talk to God about the fact that maybe you've turned a corner in your mind or in your heart, in your belief. Another important thing to do, I think, is to tell somebody else. If we don't verbalize what's going on inside, it kind of just stays inside, never becomes really a part of who we are. It's so important to be able to tell somebody, you know what, I think I turned a corner recently in my belief, in my mind, in my heart. Maybe I'm not an atheist anymore. Maybe I'm not an agnostic anymore. Maybe I'm actually a believer. I don't know what that means. I don't know everything I believe or what I don't believe or what questions I have or where doubt is going to come in, but I think I believe. Tell somebody that. Today, before the day is over, just say, here's what I believe. Here's what I've come to believe. We're going to have prayer partners up here after our service. They would love to hear you say what you believe. If you're looking for someone to tell, or tell a Christian friend, or tell a spouse, here is what I believe. And finally, I would say, commit to continue the journey. You know, coming to the place where we say, you know what, I believe. It's not an end, but it's a beginning. It's a beginning of what I believe is an amazing journey, adventure with a God who is able to do in our lives and through our lives so much more than we could ever imagine. And so commit to continuing the journey. And I believe the Bible tells us that means becoming a part of the church, surrounding yourself with other people who are on the same journey, who have the same beliefs and values. Ask questions. Find resources that will answer the kind of questions that you need answered. And if you're willing, be baptized. Baptism is a way that we signify the fact that we are starting a new relationship and a new journey with God. It's what Christians have done for the last 2,000 years to signify the fact that they're starting a new relationship with God. In July, we're going to be having a baptism service. Maybe you could be a part of that. If you say, you know what, I think I believe. I think I want to start this relationship with God. Maybe you could be baptized. I would love to talk to you more about that if that's the case. But right now, what I'd really like to do is pray for you. Our Father, how good to come to you, a God who started the universe with a word, and be able to call you Dad. You have given us so much evidence to know not only that you are, but what you are like. That you're a God who has acted to send a rescuer into the world to save us from our own mistakes. What a beautiful story. A God who would become a man, who would be killed, and predict and pull off his own resurrection. Couldn't make that up, God. You're awesome. For those of us who believe, God, strengthen our belief. Help us deal with our doubts. Bring us to new questions that will stretch our heart, keep us focused on you. And for those of us who are maybe just turning a corner, Lord, may we commit to talk to you about it, to tell someone else, and to commit ourselves to the journey. And just begin to live this great adventure that you have for every one of us. Until you come again, we pray. Amen.